Hello, everyone. Today, I want to have an adult conversation with all of you and go over some history. The goal of this is education, hopefully, to provide some clarity so that we know how things started and how we ended up in the predicament that we're in right now. Also, for those of you who might not be in the States, or you might be in the States and not know all of this history, at the end of the day, the goal is to provide some clarity. And in that, you should be able to find some solutions because many of you are going to find yourselves in many angles of what I'm going to talk about today. Uh, of course, there's no malice in what I'm saying, but that will not stop many of you from being offended at a lot of what I have to say. So, to start off, I'll say that if you are not an adult and cannot handle truth, history, and facts, this is not the session for you. Um, this is for critical thinkers. These are for people who love the truth. These are for people that are actually looking for solutions and are truthfully interested in knowing why we're in the predicament that we're in right now. How did all of this happen? And what do we do going forward? So, I want to talk about US history. History has been one of my favorite subjects my whole life. History, science, and spirituality are the three areas that I major in, have been since I was a kid. So while other people were reading comic books, I was reading the rest of our textbook in school. While everyone else was just doing the work that we were assigned, I would go back, take the book home, and read through the whole book because I loved history. I love learning how things happen, who met who. Reading history was like reading comic books to me. So it's not something that I got into off of a fad, nor am I someone who's just jumping into history right now. I've loved history my entire life. Education is very important. That's why education is usually one of the first things that's targeted. And if you're not paying attention, you suffer the risks of being undereducated. We're definitely going to touch on that a lot, but I want to emphasize the importance of education. If you don't know anything, you don't know how to handle yourself. You don't know how to protect yourself. You don't know how to recognize danger. You don't know how to recognize when you're being harmed or when you're being mistreated, misled. Anyone can tell you anything, and you're swayed because of your lack of knowledge. Even the Bible says that my people perish due to a lack of knowledge, and that's something that shows its head in many scenarios. So don't take it lightly when you're dealing with education. Now, even the education system in America, I had issues with it, even when I was in it, right? When I was in public school, I had issues with it. When I was in college, I had issues with it. So recognizing the importance of education doesn't also mean that I don't recognize the issues in the way that education is brought about in our country specifically. But I recognize that that's a cultural thing. See, I was just in Kenya and I watched that their society as a whole is very much smarter than the United States by a lot, right? Whether you're rich or you're poor, they are a thinking people. And I love that. I love being around people who think critically as a way of life. I remember there was one moment where we were in a preschool and I'm watching them teach their colors. And the teacher says, "What color is that?" They say, "It's red." She said, "No, it's not. It's green." The kids yell back, "No, that's red." And I'm like, wow, they're learning critical thinking, not to be gaslit into, you know, not accepting what you can see just because someone very starkly tells you that what you're seeing doesn't exist. And while I'm looking at them, even in preschool, I'm like, wow, this is why this entire society is are thinkers. Whether they make a right conclusion or not, the culture itself prioritizes critical thinking, and that's amazing. Because as I was watching them go over something as simple as colors, I realized a lot of Americans would have failed that test. This is red behind me, you say. And I'm like, no, 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 this is green. Some of you say, well, I must be colorblind. I guess it's green. That the thing that you can see with your own eyes is up for question if I tell you no hard enough. That's an educational gap. That's a critical thinking gap, and that makes you easily manipulated. So, for the edification of our people, Not just Black people, but yes, us. But for Americans and even some of my foreigners that watch my content, so that you can understand, again, how we got to where we are. Why are Americans the way that we are? I'm going to give you a simple history. So let's just say things start off with Christopher Columbus, a man who was so vile that even his own country didn't herald him as a hero. They were entirely disgusted by the rape, the pillaging, the destruction, the murder, and everything else that him and his clan did across the world. He was absolutely hated, was not embraced by his own people, but somehow he's a patron of modern day America. That is a sign. You know a people by who they make heroes, who they honor, and who they mourn. A lot on that later. So this leads us into the topic of slavery. Brief history of slavery. Yeah, white people kidnapped us. Now, at the same time, right, slavery has many angles. It's not just the kidnapping and enslavement of people from the African continent. It also included the colonies that were already in the Americas before them and the Native Americans that were here beforehand. It was three separate groups that all got thrown onto the same plantations together. You have the colonies that were ran by the Moors. You have the Native Americans, and then you have the Africans who were shipped over. All three of them oppressed and enslaved, thrown on the same plantations together. Now, slavery was much more gruesome than we're used to thinking about. Oftentimes when people think of slavery, they just think of people working outside in the sun, sometimes getting hit with a whip. But no, that is the lightest version of slavery. Of course, like everything, there were some worse plantations and there were some better plantations. But knowing the way that the United States tells history, there's a lot of gruesome things that just never make it into our history books that you find while doing other research. Like I said, I read books for a living. So in reading a lot, you come across a lot of things. So you find out that not only were we enslaved, but we were bred like cattle. This is why the modern Black American is related to so many people. This is why we can say we're the Moors, we're the Hebrews, we're Native Americans, we're West African, we're East African, because took people from all of those places and threw us on the same plantation and bred the healthiest and strongest of us. We got bred like cattle is the point. So we actually are related to everybody. Not just that, you have rape, you have disease, you have beatings, you have killings, you have them eating us as a natural thing. Yes, not only did they kill us and they beat us, but there's a history of white people eating us as well and using our skin and our bones to make furniture as well. Very gruesome history. They tell you that George Washington had dentures made of teeth. They usually leave out the fact that they were made of slaves' teeth instead. The dolls, the couches, the stuffing in the couches, the stuffing in pillows, a lot of times was made from the hair of slaves. The binding on books, which they recently found some in libraries and colleges that were made of human skin. That is slave skin. They used our skin to make leather for books and for shoes and for all types of other things. So I'm being light right now, but let's just say that period of time was very rough. It wasn't just us working for free. It was us being tortured as a way of life, while also being given the religion of Christianity as it was taught to us by the slave. Now think about it as it was taught to us by slave masters. Now think about it like this. You take a people away from their culture, whichever of the three possible cultures they could have come from, whether from the African continent, the Moorish colony, or from the Native Americans, and you strip them of their culture, force them and forbid them for practicing their own language and their own culture. It doesn't take long for them to forget where they came from, especially when you outlaw reading and writing for slaves. I want to paint a picture that slavery was a horrible thing because in the modern day, that's something that's being debated again. If slavery was even that bad. So I'm being a little drastic right now as to drive the point home that slavery was indeed horrible. But I do also believe that slavery wasn't the worst thing to happen to us. The worst thing to happen to us was what happened after the slaves got freed. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So during the time of President Abraham Lincoln, tensions between the North and the South were rising because the North was experiencing a boom in industry. Steel and oil are taking off. Meanwhile, the South still has a market on agriculture, and they're doing it via the use of slaves. So while the North is building machinery and you're getting your steel and your oil refinement, the South is still blossoming because of its agriculture. And all of that work of agriculture, I can't sell you my machines if you still have sales. So there's a truth to the fact that some people say that the Civil War wasn't about slavery. It was about industry versus agriculture. That is true, but the main instrument of agriculture at that time was very much slavery. So you can't rule it out. It's something that came up at multiple times, regardless of which side you're reading about when discussing the Civil War, which is the North versus the South, the Union versus the Confederacy, the Northern Union, the Southern Confederacy. Now, the South fought to keep their slaves for multiple reasons. One, they believed in the suppression of Black people. We weren't seen as people. So even when we start off with the creation of the nation, the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, you have this thing that happens where they say all men are created equal, written by Thomas Jefferson, who was owning slaves at the time. That goes to show that our country wasn't created and our laws weren't made with us as people in mind. That's just an unfortunate fact. That if you can somehow keep slaves and also say that all men are created equal, something's not quite right. So that's how they got away. We were considered property. We were considered cattle. We were not considered people yet. Even when we did eventually gain our right to vote, and we'll get to that later because that's very important, we still weren't considered wholly people, fully human. We were considered 3/4 of a person. Coming back to that. So let's go back to the Civil War and what would become the Emancipation Proclamation. So Abraham Lincoln, he does this thing called the Emancipation Proclamation, which is where he decides, he issues a letter. And I want to be clear on Abraham Lincoln. He did not free the slaves out of his love of the slaves, out of his love for Black people. Abraham Lincoln went on record several times saying that if I could do this without freeing a single slave, I will. If I have to free some slaves to do it, I will. His hand was forced. It was not brought out of compassion. So when you're president and you have two halves of your country fighting, he did what he thought would solve the problem. Now, again, you have the Confederacy fighting to keep their slaves. Okay. He releases the Emancipation Proclamation, which is him freeing the slaves. Now, truthfully, even though we were freed at this time, we didn't find out that we were free until Juneteenth, which was a little ways away from when the Emancipation Proclamation was written. That's kind of why we celebrate Juneteenth, because though we were free on a legislative level, we weren't practically free until Juneteenth. And even then, it didn't really go into full effect until the 13th Amendment was passed, which is the one that supposedly abolishes slavery. We'll definitely talk about that later. So you have the North versus the South, slavery versus no slavery. Well, history goes that the Confederacy loses. The South loses, the slaves are freed. All of that happens, right? Well, here's something that was very important is that after the slaves were freed and the Confederacy were defeated, it wasn't like a football game where you're like, all right, good game. We lost. Oh, well, let's go have some pie. No, the Confederacy was pissed. They were punished, but honestly not punished enough. They lost their right to vote. That was the punishment of the Confederacy, is that the government stripped them of their ability to vote. You know, there's something that I hear people bring up a lot. And it again goes back to this lack of education thing. To know a fact without history means you don't really understand the fact. So in the modern day, people will say this thing where they'll say, well, you know, Democrats were the Confederacy and Democrats founded the KKK, and they are correct. That is a true fact. But let's go over that for a moment. Because what is the purpose of the Klan? Where did they come from? Right? So, yes, it's true. During the Civil War, the Democrats were the party of the conservatives who wanted to keep things the way that they were. And they were Democrats at that time, right? The conservatives of that day were Democrats during this time, 100% true. And they later became the founders of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, as I was just saying, as punishment for their rebellion, the Confederates lost their ability to vote. They lost their right to vote. As a result, Black people maintained 60% of the political and socioeconomic power in the South. That is a large number to have control as a minority. This is important. This created the KKK's main goal, which was to regain power for the white Southerner via vote, to regain their vote. So the Klan was invented to fight against Black people's right to vote as a means to regain power and return to a society where white dominance was the standard. This is why the Klan was invented. You have to keep that in mind. The Klan was invented for that reason. It was to secure the white vote after the Confederacy lost it as punishment. Okay. So let's talk about this period. We're going to come back to talk about the Klan, but I wanted you to get that first. So you have the Civil Rights era, you have Jim Crow. This is the period of time after the abolishment of slavery. Well, what is Jim Crow? You know, a lot of people didn't pay attention in history class. A lot of our history teachers were football coaches. So what actually happened during Jim Crow? Well, Jim Crow is what happens when, you know, the slaves are now free. Black people can now vote, but you don't want them to vote. So you create legislation in place that looks genuine, but directly targets specific people. So, for example, in order to vote, some of the Jim Crow laws is that in order to vote, you had to be able to read and write. Well, slaves were forbidden to read and write. Most freed slaves and former slaves were illiterate. They weren't allowed to read and write. So that meant that they couldn't vote because they couldn't read and write. And that's how you get legislation to target a people without ever saying Black people can't vote. You just target things that are specific to them. One of the other examples of a Jim Crow law, they said, well, your grandparents had to have been free. Well, we're early in this era. That means that, well, no one's grandparents were free, which meant Black people can't vote. They don't have any free grandparents. So there was a lot of slick stuff like that to keep Black people from being able to vote. It was the fact that even when we did vote, we counted as 1/4 of a person or 1/3 of a person, not a full person, right? Which meant that more of us had to vote in order just to secure one vote for those of us who were eligible to vote. This is where people like Martin Luther King come into effect, because he's fighting for our right to vote. He say we should be able to vote, and our vote should equal the same as white people, just because all people are actually equal. Let my one vote be the same as his white vote. It's the main fight. Just the fight for equality and for equity. So civil rights was all about creating equality and equity. What is well, equality is everyone getting the same things of the same quality. Equity is going back and raising the low places and lowering the high places, as the Bible would put it. In an area where there's a deficit, this is a form of reciprocity. Right? If you are negatively affected, if we don't start off at the same level, I have to give you something a little bit more to balance that out, so that we actually do start on a similar playing field. In order for there to be true equality, there has to be equity. So during this time period, you have people like Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and the Black Panther Party of self-defense. You have to say the whole thing, otherwise you forget what the Black Panther Party was created for. Now, before we talk about them too much, let's talk about what was actually created during this time as well. The Nazis. It's the reason I'm talking about this, because there's important parallels to be had later. So we have this thing called the Nazis. Now, Hitler went on to say that he was inspired by watching the South's mistreatment of Black people. Hitler said that himself. Pretty much, he saw how Black people were being treated in the South and said, well, if they can get away with that, I should have no problems. So though the Nazis were started in Germany, they were inspired by what was happening in the States. So it's kind of hard for you to be anti-Nazi and pro-Confederacy. When the Confederacy actually gave birth to the Nazis, that's its parent. Another nation was inspired by us. One of the most gruesome atrocities on camera, second most gruesome atrocity on camera. The first being what's happening in Palestine right now. So all the horrible things that we know about during the Holocaust, keep in mind that Anne Frank and Martin Luther King were born the same year and would be the same age. So they're happening at the same time. Now, there's this important thing that happened. So you have Martin Luther King, who's going about getting our rights and fighting for our actual freedoms, fighting against segregation and all these other things, and fighting for them from the position of peace and pacifism, nonviolence. Now, understand this about Martin Luther King. His legacy tainted what he actually was and what he was actually about. When you listen to the full speeches of Martin Luther King and you read the books from the people who knew him, he was very different than the way that we were typically taught about him. See, though Martin Luther King himself pushed for nonviolence, and that was his area, that was his angle of getting our rights, he never actually condemned people who went at it violently, because he understood the horrors of what was actually happening to us. He saw it as a realistic reaction to these atrocities. Getting attacked by dogs, getting lynched, getting killed, all of this stuff. Malcolm X believed in self-defense. He believed that if someone is hurting you, you should be able to defend yourself. The Black Panther Party of self-defense was created for the same reason. So the Black Panther Party, they were created of a similar mentality to Malcolm X. They said, well, we're watching the police hunt down and kill our people. They're like, even our criminals should just get arrested, go to court, go to trial, and maybe go to jail. You shouldn't be getting beaten. You shouldn't be getting killed just because you might have committed a crime. So the Black Panther Party were people in the neighborhoods, just regular civilians who partnered together and said, we're going to watch the police do their job to make sure they're not doing too much that's not their job. They're like, fine, arrest them. If they were doing a crime, arrest them. That's fine. We're not anti-justice, we're anti-brutality. So when the police pulled their guns on people who were nonviolent, they would pull their guns on the police. It took the combined effort of all three of these factions for us to get any of the rights that we have. You have people getting beat, people being killed, people getting lynched, people being tortured, dogs being sicked on them, the police fighting on them, the fire department fighting on them, the hospitals, the nurses, and the ambulances all partnering together to harm Black people and dismantle our movement. That is an unfortunate reality, an unfortunate history. You think about it, right? You hear a lot about police brutality and forget that the fire department was right there with them. Where else do you think we get the footage of fire hoses being turned on people for protesting? Yeah, the fire department helped. In fact, there's been many stories of fire departments either not responding when they knew that a fire was happening in a Black neighborhood, or they would go into the house, not look for anyone, listen to people burn and die, and then leave saying they couldn't find anyone. So though it goes under a lot of people's radar, the fire department has served just as much a part in our desolation as the police have. Now, going back to something I mentioned earlier, let's talk about the parties. You know, we mentioned that Democrats were the Confederacy and the Klan, right? The founders of both, the parties that occupied both, right? But currently in the States, Democrats don't fly the Confederate flag. Republicans do. When did that happen? Right now, people who are pro-Confederacy are currently Republican. When did that happen? Neo-Nazis used to be Democrat, are currently Republican. When did that happen? Did that start with Trump? No, it didn't start with Trump. Long before him. I can blame him for a lot, but not that. So there was this thing called the Southern Project. So when did the Republican Party become the party of white Christians? It happened under Nixon, President Nixon. Now, when was Nixon in office? Oh, Nixon actually took power the year after Martin Luther King was shot. That's important because history records Dr. Martin Luther King as being a Republican. That's because Democrat and Republican are on opposite sides. While he was alive and immediately switched after his death. Kind of important. Now, under Nixon, when the KKK and other white supremacist movements joined the Republican Party, they brought their religion with them. The KKK was and is a Christian organization, just as the Nazi Party was in Germany. They were both Christian organizations. Now, the Democrats were the party, just to go back, the Democrats were the party of the conservative white races up until President Nixon. It was under Nixon that lifelong conservative Democrats switched parties because the Democratic Party had lost its edge and was no longer helping them to regain or maintain supremacy. Nixon partnered with the KKK, and the Republican Party became the new home for white supremacists. This happened under President Nixon. Now, why did I mention Christianity in that? You have to remember the Klan is a Christian organization. It is still labeled a Christian organization. The Klan is simply seen as people exercising their religion right now, which means the government helped to destroy every other anti-KKK movement and labeled them terrorist organizations, but the Klan is still labeled a religion, a denomination. Why does this matter? Why does the Klan matter so much? The Klan ran Christianity in America. In fact, the Grand Wizard, who's the head of the Klan, actually had a seat in the US government. The Klan was the original faith office. You know, how Trump just instituted a faith office, which very much goes against the Constitution. Well, the Klan did that first. Important parallels to be made. So you had people whose entire mission was to suppress black people, oppress black people, and regain the power that white supremacists once had, and return black people to a form of oppression so that they can be slaves again, in the White House helping to write the laws. Not just that, but they're in charge of the religion. Hey, have you ever wondered, growing up, you notice differences in our culture. We have white church, we have black church. We notice, black church all day long. You in church for hours. But it's a common stereotype, especially in the South, that white church is short. 30 minutes, an hour, hour and a half, and they out of there, right? Why did that start? Well, that started during the Jim Crow era. Remember, the Klan is a Christian organization. Lynchings were a regular activity. It's actually where we get the word picnic from. You read between the lines. So what would happen on Sunday mornings, white pastors and white churches would get out early, go to black churches and snatch the preachers and grab a few people from the congregation, take them to the park, hang them and burn them as their after church lunch. So they practice getting out of church early because that's what they went to go do afterward. Notice how their Christianity didn't stop them from committing these atrocities. In fact, they used the Bible in their Christianity to support their activities. Not very different than how it works today. Now, this is something that's been happening for forever. Even during the time of slavery, they had a Bible that they let slaves read if they were able to read, and it was called the Slave Bible. It had just enough for a slave to stay submissive and be a Christian, but nothing in it that would lead to them being inspired. So they would obviously take out stories like the Exodus so that you don't get inspired, so that the slaves don't get inspired hearing about God punishing a leader for having slaves. They took that out. Instead, they left in slaves obey your masters. They left in the part of the Bible where it says that it's okay to beat your slave. They left all those things in. So using Christianity to justify atrocities is not new by any means. It's how it's been used. Now, throughout history, we watched Christians have different stances as it pertains to racism, the Klan, white supremacy, and all of that stuff. In the modern day, as a way to deflect and a way to hide their white supremacy, people pretend that if you fight racism, you're equal to or worse as racist itself. That's a deflection to hide and stop you from ever solving the real problem. And that's not new, right? See, white Christian nationalism and the doctrines that you have as it pertains to this topic depend on who your preachers were and what sides they took during this time. I'll give you an example. I'll give you 4 white preachers and how they all responded differently to the Klan. In fact, I'll give you 5. You have F.F. Bosworth. Yeah, some real revival people, powerful people who moved in the supernatural, miracle signs and wonders. Holy Ghost filled, speaking in tongues, healing the sick, casting, all of that, right? So you have F.F. Bosworth. F.F. Bosworth believed, this is a time during segregation. There's white church, there's black church. F.F. Bosworth said, God loves us all. We're all children of God. We're going to worship together. We're going to work together. We're going to love one another. That's what we're going to do. F.F. Bosworth said, this is what this segregation stuff isn't my God. That's weird, that's wrong, and I'm not going to do it. So he would preach and he would minister to mixed crowds. He had mixed choirs. He had all this stuff. Well, white people hated that. And there was a story where F.F. Bosworth, as anointed and spirit filled as he was, got beat to a pulp at a train station. He was on his way home. And some people said, hey, apparently you like hanging out with black people, so we're going to treat you how we treat black people. And they beat him for so long, he ended up missing his train. He missed his train home and had to walk all the way home after getting beat to a pulp. And he never stopped working with integrated crowds. He used it as fuel. He said, if this is the price I have to pay for unity, so be it. F.F. Bosworth, that's one example. Well, then we have A.A. Allen. A.A. Allen, based in Miracle Valley, Arizona. One of the most powerful healing evangelists that we have video of. One of the best, right? Not only did he do the usual all of us are equal, but A.A. Allen was an activist in his own right. And the thing that he did that was very important is that he always addressed white people for their racism, not black people, because he recognized that black people's fear and hesitation or distrust of white people was very warranted considering the circumstances that they were dealing with on a regular basis. So when he addressed racism, he always addressed white people for upkeeping it. He said, leave my black brothers and sisters alone. He had a mixed crowd. He had a mixed choir. He had ministers under him. Some of his students are still alive. Reverend Sam Nix is still alive and talks about a lot of the racial issues he dealt with working under A.A. Allen. He said A.A. Allen would put him in situations to experience racism just so he could preach against it that same day. Reverend Sam told a story where he went to A.A. Allen gave him his keys and told him to go pick his car up and drive it to come get him. He said he went into Allen's office, got his keys, and went to get in his car, and they thought he stole it and was mistreating them, harassing them, and everything else. And Sam said he got upset because when A. Allen found out about it, he didn't say anything then. So it hurt his feelings a little bit until that night he got up and preached. He said, now, I sent my brother to go pick up my car and y'all harassed him. Why? Y'all know he with me. He said, if I would have signed maybe RW, would y'all have stopped him? No, y'all only stopped my brother because he was black. So A. Allen would do that stuff. He preached against them, calling people the N-word, using racial slurs. One of my favorite things he did is that he spoke to the imaginary shields that racist people use as it pertains to ministry, where they would have no problem maybe preaching to a black audience, but didn't want to send under black preachers. This is how you get Assemblies of God and Church of God in Christ. Is that the white people in Assemblies of God had no problem working with and preaching to mixed audiences, but having a black preacher over them was a bit much. So they separated. Well, A. Allen spoke to that. He spoke to people not letting black people in their congregation. He spoke to the fact that many people will go minister overseas to black people in Africa, but hate the black people in their neighborhoods when they come back home. Yeah, A. Allen talked about that. And that sounds very familiar. I know a few ministries. I know some ministries that go to Latin American countries. They in Mexico, they in Honduras, they're in all these other places, and they cheer on the mistreatment of Latinos in America right now. Very common. A. Allen preached against you. I want you to know that. So A. Allen stayed committed to fighting against the Klan, white supremacy, and racism every chance he got. Well, then we have William Branham. William Branham wasn't racist himself. He had integrated crowds. He had mixed crowds. He preached with everybody. He worked with everybody. He had no problems. However, he never condemned the Klan. And in his own words, he said it's because the Klan helped him when he was younger. So he feels some sense of loyalty to the Klan just because they helped him out. So he never spoke against them. With as many atrocities as they were committing around him, as he was in the South too, William Branham never spoke against him. Okay. Right. Then we have Charles Parham. Who was Charles Parham? He was the spiritual father and mentor of William Seymour, who was the founder and beginner of the Azusa Street Revival. Now, how did William Seymour end up on Azusa Street in California in the first place? You know, the place where he received the baptism of the Spirit was actually in Houston, Texas, in a park called Tranquility Park. The city of Houston itself is built around that very area. So how did someone who received their baptism in Houston end up in California? Right. See, Robert Slearden doesn't like to talk about it. He usually skips over this in his books and tries to downplay it, but it was due to racism. They were embarrassed that the Negro that they made sit outside was the one who received the power, and they didn't. So out of hatred and embarrassment, they shipped him off to California so that they didn't have to be reminded of him anymore. And that only further spit in their face. Now, mind you, Charles Parham was running the school that sat him outside, made him listen through the window. Only when it rained was he allowed to sit on the inside of the building, still outside of the door. Now, when William Seymour's revival took off, Azusa was the greatest revival happening on the planet at that time. Study the Azusa Street Revival if you haven't. Well, William Seymour, trying to be a good Christian, reached out to his spiritual father and mentor, Charles Parham, trying not to be offended, trying to be unoffendable, leaving the past in the past, right? Well, Charles Parham comes over, jealousy in his heart, and says, you know what? All of this is demonic. And it's not that it was demonic. It's just that Black people were experiencing the Spirit on a level that he wasn't. He was embarrassed. He was jealous, he was envious, and he wanted it gone. William Seymour and Charles Parham fell out, and that actually ended up being the end of the Azusa Street Revival. Now, Charles Parham was so racist, he was willing to shut down a move of God. Yes, racism was the downfall of the Azusa Street Revival. How else do we know this? Well, John G. Lake, one of the other people I want to talk about, actually wrote Charles Parham a letter calling him a fat racist. Yeah. Not only did he preach against racism, but he called out racist preachers that he knew about. Wrote him a strongly worded letter. Those are the different ways in which people dealt with racism that were Christian. So depending on the type of preacher you had a different message being preached at your church. And a lot of what we have today is what I call Klansman Christianity, meaning that your ideologies came from the Klan, even if your family weren't specifically Klan's members, just because the church that you were under, the denomination, the legacy, the stream that you were under, at some point aligned itself with the ideologies of the Klan and knew how to cover it with Christianity. So a lot of what you have is Klansman Christianity. What's an example of Klansman Christianity? Klansman Christianity is when you tell Black people that racism is their fault because they won't forgive. That's not the gospel, nor is that the Bible. That's Klansmen who don't want retaliation for their behavior. They don't want accountability. They just knew how to cover it with scripture. Klansman Christianity tells Black people y'all shouldn't want reparations. Just let it go. Meanwhile, in the Bible, when you look at the story of Exodus, well, when Moses and the Israelites left, they took a bunch of riches with them. They took their reparations. We also have to mention Coming off of Klansman Christianity, we have mass incarceration. Now, what is mass incarceration? Mass incarceration was the intentional targeting of Black people and the arresting of them, whether innocent or guilty. It's the over-policing of Black neighborhoods. So in order to fill the prisons. Now, why in the world would they want to arrest more Black people? It's because there's a loophole in the 13th Amendment. See, a lot of times people don't actually read the amendments. It doesn't just say that slavery is abolished, slavery is illegal now. It doesn't say that. The 13th Amendment says that slavery is abolished and is illegal unless it is the punishment of someone who has committed a crime, which means if we want to maintain our slaves, you got to go to jail. Which is why still in the States today, we have active plantations being repurposed and used as prisons. So in Louisiana, you have a few plantations being used as prisons. The idea behind mass incarceration is to get our slaves back, which is the idea of the Klan, who infiltrated the government. Right. So let's move on a little bit further in history. 2008, President Barack Obama, first Black president that they tell us and are open about us having. The unfortunate thing about President Obama is that he was beloved. Whether I agree or disagree with everything that he did or not, en masse, he's loved. A lot of things that were supposed to fail ended up succeeding while he was in office. He did a lot of things right. And that was the bad part. See, President Obama actually put white supremacists in a state of grief, in a state of shock, in a state of fear, because of one thing: fear of retaliation. See, Dr. Jane Elliott is in her 90s. She's still alive. I love her. I've worked with her in the past. I've talked to her a few times. Amazing woman. I promise, one of the best people on the planet right now. And something that she did, she actually started her ministry the day Martin Luther King got shot. And she invented what was known as the blue eyes, brown eyes exercise. And in that exercise, she put people in an environment, in a situation that simulated racism enough for white people who don't experience racism to be able to get what it's like to be Black, to experience how it feels to be in our shoes for a moment. And in doing these exercises, she gets a lot of white people to admit that their biggest fear, the reason why they pretend to not notice racism, the reason why they gaslight, the reason why they hide, the reason why they fight, is because they're afraid that if Black people ever rise to power, they're going to do to them what they did to us, that we're going to do to them what they did to us. And every time she asked Black people, hey, do y'all want revenge or do y'all just want equality and to be left alone? And almost every time, Black people say, no, we really just want to be left alone. Because that is often a common thing. How come Black people just don't forget, move on, work on yourselves, build your communities? Oh, you don't know history because it's not taught in our public schools. You got to read books. You got to go to the library. You got to do research to learn some of this stuff. We've done that multiple times throughout history. Of course, you have the Tulsa Massacre of 1921. There's survivors from that are still alive today. That's one of the most common ones. You have Oscarville in 1912, which is now known as Lake Lanier. They blew it up, bombed it, set it on fire, an entire Black civilization that was thriving. And then they flooded it and turned it into a lake. You have the New Orleans Massacre, 1866, Opelousas Massacre, 1868, Springfield, 1908, St. Louis, 1917, Orangeburg, 1968, Buffalo, New York, 2022. More actual cities and neighborhoods that were intentionally destroyed, whether by massacres or by buying out the property or redistributing and building highways through the neighborhood. Did you know that the reason for freeways and highways and their placements was intentionally to destroy thriving Black communities? It was to make them unlivable so that people didn't want to be there. It was intentionally to displace Black families that were thriving. So you have Rosewood, 1923, Oco, 1920, Elaine, Arkansas, 1919, Black Bottom and Paradise Valley in the 50s and 60s. Get this, Seneca Village, which is now known as Central Park. That was an entire neighborhood that was wiped out and turned into a park. 1850. In Morrisonville, the 80s. So we have a history that goes back pretty far of us trying to forgive and forget, move on, and just work on ourselves. And every single time, even as recent as I want to say it was 2023, a boxer, Tank Davis, went and bought his former neighborhood. He went and bought a block. The very next day, it was set on fire. And I believe that was Philadelphia. So yes, this stuff still happens. So the idea of, oh, just forget, forgive, move on doesn't work and has never worked and it doesn't work because Black people's forgiveness or lack thereof has never been the problem. In fact, us being too forgiving has been the problem. We'll talk about this. So when racist white people saw a Black person become president and win twice, that broke something in them, that put them into a state of panic. And we have what we know as, they're afraid now. They started being afraid. They started reacting to possibilities that did not exist and really weren't on the cusp of anything. Just the idea that if Black people continue to be inspired and get into power, they're going to flip the script and they're going to start getting their revenge on us. Even though Black people across the board have said we don't want revenge, we just want to be left alone. But that doesn't matter. Fear oftentimes makes people illogical. So that brings us to today. Starting off in 2016, you have President Trump's election. Now, why in the world does Trump matter right now? It's because he appealed to the people who were terrified by a Black person becoming president. When he made his slogan, "Make America Great Again." Now, what is this again that we're referring to? It's referring to a time where Black people were suppressed, white people were supreme, and even women didn't have as many rights. Did you know that women weren't allowed to open up their own bank accounts until the 80s? So you wonder why your grandparents and or great-grandparents' relationships lasted so long. It's because grandma didn't have a choice. It's not that their love was that strong. It was that they didn't have a choice. And that's an idea that they're returning back to. So as a response to that much progress, you got to balance that out. You got to have someone so committed to conservatism being returning things back to the way that they were, that it undoes years and years, decades and decades of progress. Now, is this just my theory because I don't like Trump? No, Trump has said this himself. He's gone on record, especially on his Twitter account, even as recently as this year, talking about the great replacement theory. That is the theory that white people are soon to no longer be the majority in America, and something has to be done about that to preserve the race. Now, why would white people be afraid of becoming a minority if racism doesn't exist and systematic racism doesn't exist? Again, the fear is that revenge will come, that they will have to experience life the way that the rest of us experience life within the country. So even though, racist people, Klansmen are very sneaky, they're very open, right? Even with a lot of Trump's policies, you're dealing with what a thing is presented to be versus what the actual goal is. See, even with the idea of illegal immigration, the issue that they're having is not illegal immigration. The motive behind it is the great replacement theory. He's speaking to the hearts of all the racist white people who are afraid of being replaced by another demographic. And Latinos fall into a threat category because they have a lot of kids. Now, you have to think about something. The government does not care about us. So anytime they're talking about an issue, they're not talking about solving that issue for us. In fact, what makes it hard for them is that they have to find a way to solve that problem for them, racist white people, that in a way that does not benefit the other demographics. This is why they fight against free healthcare. This is why they fight against student loan forgiveness. This is why they fight against these things that obviously would benefit everyone. And that's the problem. It would benefit everyone. So when you say things like, so when you hear things like, oh, you know what? We're going to dismantle pretty much the civil rights era itself that's happening right now. Actual legislation, not just talk. One of the first things Trump did when he got back in office this year was rescind the executive order that was the Equal Employment Opportunity Act that forbid people from discriminating in a job place based on race, ethnicity, gender, or sexuality. Yeah, he went after that on day one. Now, why in the world would you go after that? Well, the presentation that you get is no one should get a job just because of their skin color. No one should get a job just because of their gender. No one should get a job because of their sexuality. It should all be based on merit. That sounds very noble, but the motive behind it is very sinister. Because those laws were created for a reason. Now, why in the world would the government have to create an Equal Employment Opportunity Act? Oh, that's because racist white people were discriminating based on race, sexuality, and gender. Therefore, a law had to be put in place to stop them from doing that. People who were qualified or even at times overqualified to do the job well were getting passed up because they were the wrong color. Therefore, a law had to be put in place. I learned that when I was a kid. I remember I went into a market one day. We were in a store and I saw they were selling underwear on the rack and it had a sign above it that said it cannot be returned. And I asked my mom, I'm like, well, why would they say that? That's interesting. Who would try to return underwear after it's been worn? And she said, well, all rules are there for a reason. Usually something happens that results in them having to create a rule. And that stuck with me my whole life. So whenever I see strange rules, I think, well, what must have happened for that to have needed to be a rule? You hear old people joke about it all the time. You know, they say back then our manuals, when you're changing your oil, told you how to change your oil. Now they tell you not to drink the oil. That's because people were drinking it. So likewise, the reason we have so much legislation as it pertains to DEI, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is why we have all these civil rights laws, is because our civil rights were being disrespected, disregarded, and people were losing their livelihoods based solely off of things that should not matter in a workplace environment. Only thing that should matter in a workplace environment is how good you are at the job. But that wasn't going into effect. People were intentionally passing up people, and people were getting passed up for promotions and then being asked to train people who weren't qualified. Now, I have that story. I have that story myself of training people in my job in the past who were less qualified than myself. Now, I was qualified enough to train them to do the job and to be my boss, but not qualified enough to just get the promotion. And that's something that's been happening for decades. Getting the person who's worked at a place for decades, knows the company inside out, to train someone who doesn't know anything so that they could have the promotion. Only because color. So the thing that scares me about racist white people, specifically racist white Christians, I'll be honest, is how noble they can sound while defending some of the most inhumane acts in history. Lynchings are covered up as they're just trying to take care of their family. Sounds noble, is absolutely horrible. Just recently, you have a bunch of white people in their 30s promoting rape, racism, white supremacy, and Nazism, and the vice president says those are just kids. Everyone said something dumb before. Everyone makes mistakes. I've heard it said, and I felt this sentiment even in my own life, that white people get to be just kids their whole life. You know, I was experiencing racism as early as pre-K. And I'm a stern believer that if we're able to experience racism at our young ages, should be able to learn about it and begin to fight against it at early ages. I didn't make it out of elementary school before I was getting called the N-word. Which means that's a good time to start learning about anti-racism if we're going to solve the problem. Now, understand, Trump's entire regime is all about returning to white supremacy. It's a Klansman culture. His father was a Klansman. Klansman ideology doesn't go away, especially when you ignore it. It actually thrives in the darkness. The longer it goes unaddressed, the more powerful it becomes. So this idea of, oh, whatever you talk about, you're giving energy to it. That's usually coming from someone that's in support of what's going on and just wants you to shut up. People who are trying to protect themselves from feeling guilty, rather than trying to actually solve the problem. Where the person blowing the whistle and fighting against the problem gets in more trouble than the problem itself. That's because people don't see it as a problem. They actually want it to thrive. Which is why also a lot of what I shared gives you the answer as to why so many Christians would back someone as unchristlike as the current president. It's not about God using a crooked stick to hit a straight lick. God can use it. It's not about that, even though they say that. They love him because he matches the form of Christianity that their preachers preach, which is, again, the Klansman Christianity that I spoke about earlier. Again, Klansman Christianity says that if you're black and you speak against racism, it's because you're worshiping your ethnicity and your skin color. Not that you're moved by compassion and are wishing for a world of unity. And somehow those same people have the audacity to quote Martin Luther King in defense of the current regime, which is undoing all of the work that Martin Luther King died for. You have to pay attention at some point. So again, talking about what the actual goal is, see, even though the reason that Latinos are being targeted is because of their high birth rate and the fear of the great replacement, That's why they're being targeted. It's not about legal versus illegal. This is why legals and illegals are all being rounded up right now and deported. It's not about you being legal or illegal. It's about you being Latino and possibly producing more youth than the generation. So remember what I said earlier. They don't care about us. So when they bring up an issue, they're talking about what's going on in their community. You notice how often they've been talking about the decline in birth rate. Understand this, Black people, understand this, Asians and Latinos. They don't care about you not giving birth. That's not a problem they're trying to solve for you. They're recognizing that in white communities, that white people are being harmed in the society to the point where they're not having kids at a fast enough rate to combat the other races. But even with the socioeconomic, inequalities, Black people and Latinos are still having kids. That's a problem to them. They believe in the Great Replacement. Now, the reason I keep talking about it is because the president believes in it. He's posted about it several times on Twitter and said that's what he's fighting for. So it's not speculation. He said this himself. Want proof? Scroll his Twitter. You see a lot. Now, even with that, right? Latinos having a lot of kids, therefore we got to get rid of them. Understand this. Latinos are still a red herring. The actual goal is not just to get rid of Latinos. That's phase one. The goal is deeper. The goal of the Confederacy still remains they want their slaves back. How do I know this? Well, Donald Trump said something very interesting. He said, if I get rid of the Latinos, the reason I have to get rid of the Latinos is that they're taking the Black jobs. Said, okay, the Black jobs. And we asked the question, we were like, what are these Black jobs? Well, the jobs that the Latinos were working were all the jobs that paid so low, none of us actually wanted to do them, which were working in the fields and farms. A lot that flew over a lot of people's ears. But again, using Twitter as my source, I got to see a lot of racist white people who were honestly confused when Latinos started getting deported and Black people didn't show up to fill the spot. They said, wait a minute, Trump promised us that we were getting Black workers. I feel betrayed. They were upset on the internet. They said, we were promised our slaves back. This is something I watched happen in real time. And a lot of us knew that then. He said, they taking Black jobs. You say, what are Black jobs? He said, any job. No, he's talking about the plantation, and the farmers that, have their farms and their plantations still knew what he was talking about. Racists are very sneaky like that. So the goal isn't just to get rid of Latinos. It's not about them being criminals or anything like that. No. That's a red herring. That's what you do to any group of people that you want to harass and hurt. You just paint them as villains. It makes even the most horrible of situations look holy as long as you paint your target as wicked enough. This is how something as unholy as the Crusades can be branded in history as the Holy Crusades. This is how something as horrible as colonialism in the Americas get rebranded as manifest destiny. Meaning God told us to come over here, rape, pillage, steal, give you diseases, kill you, and take your land and property for ourselves and enslave you. God told us to do that. So understand, the goal is your Black body back on a plantation. That's the goal. And they're fishing for any reason to do so, whether through mass incarceration or just through outright snatching. In fact, when the Latinos are gone, you're next. I'm warning you ahead of time. That's where we're headed. Now, in fear of communism, which most of you don't know what it is, you actually brought in fascism, which is something much worse. Yeah. And that only happens when the poorly educated are in mass. So after years of intentionally crippling the education system and empowering people to think that their thoughts and opinions are equal to facts, we now are left in a situation where dumb people are the majority, where people know facts but don't know history. And as the current president said, he said he loves the poorly educated. Why would he love the poorly educated? Remember, I started off by telling you that the poorly educated are easy to manipulate. This is why, as recent as this year, he said, oh, smart people don't like me. Yeah, so some of those things go into effect. Some of those things are important. So when you begin to understand the history of Klansman Christianity, white nationalism, and all of that, it tells you how someone like Trump can be seen as a messiah, and someone like Charlie Kirk, as loud and racist and hateful as he was, can be branded as a Christian martyr. It tells you that they represent an aspect of Christianity that America is very dishonest about, and it's the Klansman type. It's the fact that Christianity is a tool for white supremacy and has been for a long time. And that's the angle of Christianity that they are martyrs for. See, the reason why Charlie Kirk and Trump's racism doesn't matter to a lot of Christians is because it's not void in their Christianity. They got their Christianity from Klansmen. So other races being seen as less than and not equal doesn't register as a red flag. That's just Christianity to them. And I'll say this: actions have consequences. See, we never punished the Confederacy harsh enough. We were way too forgiving of the Confederacy, and we're currently suffering the descendants of the Confederacy. Like I said, they didn't just go home like it was the end of a football game. Good game. See y'all later. We'll try again later. No. They went home with their hatred still in their heart, unrepentant. They went home. They raised families. They went to school. They became your judges. They became your police officers. They became your firemen. They became your doctors. They became your lawyer. They entered into every area of society and blended in, kept their hatred. It's even for that reason why Klansmen wore their hoods, is because in the daytime, that's your mayor. That's your judge. That's your lawyer. So when you go to court to say, hey, you go to call the police and say, hey, the Klansmen were at my house last night. Well, the Klansman who was just outside of your house that you don't know is the police chief gets to dismiss your case. So no, they didn't just disappear. They didn't just get redeemed because they were forgiven. They festered and they worsened and they waited, looking for an opportunity and looking for a herald, and they got them one in 2016. And now they're getting everything that they wanted in 2025. Project 2025 is the white supremacist handbook. It's all about dismantling everything that took power from white people, specifically heterosexual white males, and giving it back. And since there was never any legislation that limited white people, only legislation that promoted other groups due to equity, you then have to attack diversity, equity, and inclusion, because those are enemies to white supremacy, and white supremacy is the goal. That means that white men now get to decide who gets jobs, who makes money, who gets healed, who gets healthcare, who gets this and who gets that. That's even the incentive behind ICE. Let's go back to them telling you what problems are without them telling you what the problem is. Remember, they don't care about you. So when you have RFK stand up there and say that, well, men that are 65 and older have more testosterone and it's younger girls who are the most fertile, Not only is he admitting to being a pedophile, but he's also giving a possible solution to the great replacement theory. He say if we just let pedophiles on the loose, we let the old men mess with the young girls, then that means that that's one way to secure that our race gets to populate. If we, right now in the middle of the government shutdown, one of the things that they're arguing about, the orange man and his people, is lowering the age of consent to 14. Now, why would they do that? Is that just because they like pedophiles and they are pedophiles? They are, but it's deeper than that. Highest rate of pedophilia in the country is white men. So if you shorten it, and now that's not actually as illegal because you go down to about 14, that means more of them get to have kids. The fear is them becoming a minority, and they're doing everything in their power to maintain that supremacy, maintain being the larger number. They're not trying to solve a solution for you. That is a solution for white supremacists. This is why they don't want to release the Epstein files. This is why they don't want to crack down on pedophile rings, is because that's actually a solution to their problem. Their problem is declining birth rates. So if you release the rapists and you release the pedophiles and you empower them, well, then you get more kids. You get more generations. You get more white supremacists. You have to read between the lines. Understand the government does not love you. They're never looking to help you. So even when it comes down to wealth, one of the questions is, okay, right? They're noticing the decline in birth rate. But they understand that the reason why so many even white people aren't having kids is because the economy sucks. But they can't fix the economy, because if they fix the economy, that fixes it for everybody. So no, we need to continue to tank the economy. That suppresses everyone else. But what we can do is pay ICE agents better than everyone else in the company. That incentivizes white supremacy. So the only people who can afford healthcare and the only people who can afford housing are ICE agents, white supremacists. So they can now afford to have kids. That gives money to white supremacists without giving it to the rest of the people. This is the purpose that ICE plays. This is how they're getting their children that they're afraid of losing. This is how they maintain numbers. This is why currently undoing all of the works of the civil rights movement. Now understand this, right? I just told you that we didn't punish the Confederacy. We took away their right to vote, which they eventually got back. That was not a punishment. We delayed something, but they were not actually punished. All they did was piss them off, and they're waiting, and we're getting the repercussions of that. See, the difference between the United States and Germany, right? Germany had the Nazis. The Nazis, who I told you earlier, were inspired by the United States. They were inspired by the South's treatment of Black people, right? After the Nazis fell, Germany was absolutely disgusted by the operations of the Nazis. Flying a Nazi flag, 100% illegal. You go to jail for that in Germany. It is zero toleration for Nazism. As a part of their curriculum, they learn about how horrible the Holocaust was, what they did, how it happened, how that built, so that those generations that grow up there know how to recognize the signs of fascism and nip it in the bud before it can start. And even as a part of their curriculum, they have to go and visit some of the concentration camps just so they could get the feel of how horrible it was. And something that's interesting is that you never hear Jews get accused of race baiting when they talk about the Holocaust. You never hear anyone say, oh, Jews need to let it go. That was so long ago, they need to let that go and just forgive. That doesn't happen. Germany doesn't require them to forget what happened. because Germany is actually sorry for what happened. The United States, on the other hand, did not punish the Confederacy. In fact, slave owners actually got reparations. The government paid them money. The country of Haiti is in the economic situation it's in because France and the United States put them in debt for lost goods. What were the lost goods? It was freed slaves. So the debt that Haiti owns to the United States and to France is because slaves were freed. Not only were they not punished, but they were actually celebrated. This is why even to this day, we have high schools named after Robert E. Lee, a Confederate general. We have schools named after Confederate soldiers. That's what you do to honor somebody. Nowhere in Germany will you come across Auschwitz High School or Adolf Hitler High. Doesn't happen because they do not honor the part of history that they don't like. They don't honor their villains. In America, we have Christopher Columbus Day, a man who was so hated by his own people at his own time. Multiple countries denounced and renounced him and punished him. But somehow he's our hero. We have statues built in honor of Confederate soldiers. So when they say, oh, no, you can't take down our statues, you can't change the names of our school, that's rewriting history. It has nothing to do with rewriting history and has everything to do with preserving white supremacy. See, architecture has psychological results. What you honor in public sends a message to the world around you. So having Confederate soldiers and memorials all around the South speaks to Black people and says you're less than, and it speaks to white people and says even at your worst, you're better than them. So it's memorials of white supremacy. These are altars. These are idols. This is why in 2020, when they started tearing down statues, that hurt. Because you're attacking the altars of white supremacy. This is where they gain their power from. You need Christopher Columbus Day. If we're trying to build on white supremacy, we need to build on the whitest and the supremacist. If we're building on your oppression, we need to celebrate the most oppressive. That's how this works. So they got reparations. Confederate soldiers were honored. All of this happened and is still being honored. Even the little bit of progress we had in that era is being undone. Schools are having their names changed back to re-honor their Confederate soldiers. Statues are being rebuilt or put back up in honor of Confederate soldiers or white supremacists. What's the point of this? Is it about history? No. They already told you they don't like when you're educated. So then, what was the problem? Again, Christianity played a huge role in the problem. I'll even go as far as to say that Christianity is leading to the fall of the nation itself. How, Sway? How is that happening? It's because we were taught forgiveness without repentance. Forgiving the Confederacy without demanding their repentance meant that we're going to suffer the results of hearts that were never changed, but were willing to play the long game. So now we're experiencing the long game. So let's talk about something. Just yesterday, we had a protest, the No Kings protest, because they're recognizing fascism. America is currently fascist. All three areas of our government are fully red, fully right-wing. The president is right-wing, and nothing that he's doing is being checked by any of the three branches of government, even though he's breaking a lot of laws within our Constitution. Power that's unchecked. Now, something they told us my entire childhood was that absolute power corrupts absolutely. We're experiencing that. And as I've said multiple times before, the very rights that Martin Luther King is heralded as he is, even by white people, the very rights that he died for are the ones that are being dismantled right now. They're currently battling over the Voting Rights Act. This means that your black vote don't matter no more if this goes through. It's the very thing Martin Luther King died for. Now, I don't like to speak negative of protests when they're in favor of actual justice and they're actually trying to be righteous. So I don't want to come off too negative when I talk about No Kings, but I have to address this. I looked at some of the footage and I'm reading the signs of the white protesters that are out at No Kings, and they're not serious enough for what's at stake. Sorry to say it this way, but they're not serious enough at all. They're cracking jokes on the signs, they're making memes on the signs, and they don't realize they're about to lose everything. The very rights that Martin Luther King and his people were taking whips to the backs, fire hoses, and police dogs for, were getting lynched and drugged. Those same rights are on the chopping block right now. And I got to say this, if you're going to protest, see, the type of protest that you do should always match the level of what's getting lost. So for you to be on the verge of losing something this important, for you to come out and protest from 10 to 12 means that you don't really care. It's not serious enough for you. 2 hours on a Saturday ain't enough. Peacefully protesting, making jokes on signs isn't enough. Sorry, people died for those rights that you're about to lose, and y'all are afraid of the government hurting you. There's too much at stake for you to be afraid of risking anything. It's not risky enough. 2 hours on a Saturday didn't cause a disturbance. The whole time No Kings is going on, President Trump is releasing AI videos of himself as a king, having everyone bow to him and flying jets, pooping on everyone that's protesting. It didn't move the party that you're worried about. The protest was meaningless. It looked nice. It showed that most people were in opposition. It was the largest organized protest in history, but it was useless because the level of intensity didn't match what was at stake at all. Y'all were out there entirely unserious. Y'all were just out at the cookout, just a get together. No, y'all weren't out there as if you're about to lose generations of work, 60 years of progress. Understand this, Martin Luther King's kids who are still alive are watching the very rights that their father died for get dismantled while they're still alive. Y'all aren't serious enough for what's at stake. See, when they were protesting 50, 60 years ago, there wasn't no 2 hours on a Saturday. It was, we'll protest until we get what we need. So 2 hours every 9 months isn't good enough. There's too much at stake. We're literally on the verge of no one's vote mattering anymore. So what I'll say is y'all need to take it serious. If you aren't willing to, if you're protesting something of this magnitude and there's no risk behind it, it's performative at best. Yes, your heart might be in the right place, but magnitude has to match. So how did we get into the predicament that we're in? Is because we never punished the Confederacy. And why did we never punish the Confederacy? It's because Christian values said that you're supposed to forgive and love your enemies, quote unquote, even if they don't repent and will come back to bite you. Hopefully we don't make the same mistake in the future. All I can say is brace for impact. We are experiencing consequences for actions. This is what happens when you cripple the education of a people and then empower them. Too many people are having their revelations a year too late. You know, in all of the history of the United States, we've only had one president put us on the watch list for genocide. Other countries are terrified for us. Did you know that other countries were protesting for us yesterday? Yeah, they protested for us. Countries with kings participated in the No Kings protest. That tells you something is up. Other countries see us a little bit different than we think we look. And that's all I'll say. We had a good talk today. Hopefully, you learned something. Hopefully, I answered some questions and put some things in perspective. I'm not going to be living in the States for long. I've been planning my exit for about 3 years now, 4 years now. Um, so yeah, what happens in the next year or so, I'm not going to be participating in, but my heart is with y'all. I have work to do elsewhere, but I am from the South. I know what it's like to grow up and you have sundown towns in every direction of the city you grow up in. 15 minutes in any direction is sundown towns. I know what it's like to be in predominantly white churches that preach white supremacy from the pulpit. I've been in those environments. So trust me, I understand racism and I understand how it operates. I've met racist worship leaders who sing their heart out for a God that supposedly loves everyone while they harbor hatred in their heart for people who speak Spanish or happen to be more melanated than them. You know, this is even a big step for me. I used to be white supremacist myself because it was unintentional, but it is a result of being in a white supremacist society. There was a point in my life I used to hate my own race. It wasn't until Holy Spirit rebuked me and told me to look a little deeper that I began to understand that I was the result of propaganda. The belief that Black people just have no integrity, won't forgive, and just like to blame white people for everything that goes wrong. Yeah, I used to believe that nonsense till I realized that we never receive reparations. We never receive help. And anytime we helped ourselves, the government and or white people came in to destroy it. Drugs intentionally introduced into our society. Even Fred Hampton, who did the one thing that I heard preached all the time. Hey, how about everyone, regardless of race, let's just work together and benefit our communities. The government shot him down in his sleep. He founded what was called the Rainbow Coalition. I actually encourage you to watch a movie called Judas and the Black Messiah. It tells you the story of Fred Hampton. There's unity if we're able, see, you only get real unity when everyone's actually getting along. Anything before that is an illusion. Silence without peace is oppression. It's possible for us to have a future where everyone's getting along regardless of race, where we can actually put history behind us, but that comes no sooner than justice. Justice, reparations. That's our way forward. Anything outside of that is performative. Anything outside of that is oppressive. To believe that the silence of Black people is our way out of racism is to believe that Black people invented racism. We didn't. So our silence. In fact, I'll tell you this. In a moment of my life where I wouldn't consider myself Black, I experienced the most racism. I just identified as Christian. I'm just a son of God. And I was seen by my color regardless of how I saw myself. So I've learned that a lot of talking points, again, come from Klansman Christianity. So I realized that no, you don't have to forsake your ethnicity or your color. You're not worshiping your color because you don't like racism. The God that you serve actually hates racism too. He preached against racism himself. The Christ that many Christians promote wasn't a white supremacist. He wasn't American. Even that's part of it. Presenting the Messiah as white is very intentionally white supremacist. That tells white people that they can identify as the savior, and it tells black people that white people are, they're emissaries of Christ. They're offshoots of Christ. It's a subconscious reprogramming, makes them more and you lesser. That's not legit. That's not Christ. That's not good. That's not holy. Now, understand this. When we talk about a victim mentality, we're not talking about something that recognizes victimhood and then begins to fight it. A victim mentality is someone who finds themselves as a victim even when nothing's happening to them, to the point where they no longer look for solutions. Oftentimes, a victim who authentically has a victim spirit or a victim mentality will join the side of their oppressor out of a sense of Stockholm syndrome. Someone that's fighting against oppression is not a victim, not in their mentality. That's actually a spirit that refuses to be a victim. That's a mentality that refuses to be victimized. And it takes more of that. So understand, if we're going to move forward and you actually want to eradicate racism in the United States, and it doesn't want to be branded a racist nation, understand that every area of institutionalized racism has to be dismantled. Every area of systemic racism has to come down. Equity and reparations have to be given in order for unity to actually exist. Even in the topic of segregation, the problem that they were having was not segregation, it was separate but not equal. Meaning that they were given the same things but of lesser quality. We got to have real equity. We got to have real equality. The way forward is not Black people suffering in silence, but all of us banding together. As long as racism is seen as a Black issue to sympathize with instead of a white issue that needs to be snuffed out, it'll stick around. Learn from A.A. Allen. Learn from John G. Lake. Learn from F.F. Bosworth. Those are the people who actually took their Christ serious enough to care about everybody. Want to get rid of racism? You have to become anti-racist. When you hear topics like this and conversations like this, you can't just say, oh, I'm white. He's speaking against racist white people. That means he hates white people. No, I don't hate white people. And white people know that. I will say this, though. If at every moment when you hear the topic of racism being discussed and you think that they're instantly hating white people, that means that you think that racism is a white trait that can't be eradicated. That means that you believe that white people by default are racist. So you're projecting something. You got to catch that stuff. I've worked with tons of white people, love them, I'm loved by them. Here's the problem, though. I found far too often white people just don't get it when it comes to the struggle because the struggle isn't theirs. They're not negatively affected by white supremacy. They're being negatively affected by it for the first time right now, so now more people are waking up to it. But for as long as Black people have been struggling, we've sung it, we've danced it, we've peacefully protested it, we've rioted it, we've acted it, we've presented the information in every way possible. It was consumed and ignored all the same. So I've already given solutions. It's something that has to be snuffed out. Truthfully, racism in America doesn't go away until it's no longer in white people or no longer tolerated in white circles. It's y'all's problem to solve. Whether the Black community chooses to forgive and forget or not isn't part of the solution. That's phase 5. Phase one is y'all not picking with us, changing your outlook, denouncing white supremacy in your own homes, in your own families, in your own friend groups, in your own society. Can't attack the fruit while still feeding the tree. All right, y'all. That's it for today. We talked about a lot. We had an adult conversation. Hopefully, y'all learned something. You understand a few things better. Maybe, maybe not. Likely a few of you got offended. Not my intention, but that happens. Many people will watch this and will be highly committed to their white supremacy. That's not my job. My job was to tell you the truth, and I believe I've done that well. I love y'all. Until next time, y'all be blessed. Later.